A single, targeted strike. Boom. Just like that, the entire diplomatic web of the Middle East gets pushed to the absolute brink. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're going to map out exactly how one localized event in Gaza is sending literal shockwaves across the region. We're going to track the latest data and break down just how interconnected and honestly how incredibly combustible this whole conflict has become.
Okay, so here's our roadmap for today. We're zooming out from the epicenter in Gaza to track the impact on the October ceasefire, decode the gridlock in Washington, map out the multi-front military escalations, and wrap up by looking at the very fragile path forward.
Right, let's dive into part 1, the target and the strike. We've got to begin right at the epicenter with the immediate news breaking out of Gaza.
So, to really grasp the sheer scale of the current tension, we have to look at the spark. Israel says it carried out an airstrike specifically targeting a major military figure, Izz al-Din al-Haddad. Now, what's super interesting here is the communication strategy. Hamas hasn't actually put out a formal, public confirmation of his death on their usual official broadcast channels. But a senior Hamas official did share the news of his passing directly with Reuters. If you've been following the tactics in this conflict, you know that withholding a formal declaration while simultaneously leaking it to the international press is a very deliberate move. It's kind of like managing domestic morale while still acknowledging the reality to the rest of the world. But the bottom line, we're looking at a huge moment of impact here, where a major military chief is reported dead, setting off an immediate chain reaction.
And get this, before that news even fully hit the international wires, witnesses on the ground in Gaza City were already hearing local mosques announcing Haddad's martyrdom. I mean, this is a really crucial detail. It shows you just how instantly the ripple formed on the ground. The temperature changed literally in minutes. You go straight from a targeted strike to an immediate, very public, localized reaction, completely bypassing any official press releases. This marks the exact moment the stone hit the water.
Moving on to part 2, the October ceasefire impact. Let's see exactly how this one specific death tests an already incredibly fragile agreement.
Listen, Haddad isn't just another battlefield commander. He is the single most senior Hamas official killed by Israel since the US-backed October ceasefire deal. And, for those of you following this closely, that October framework was basically the primary diplomatic guardrail keeping wider chaos out of Gaza. Its whole purpose was to just stop the fighting and crack open a window for de-escalation. So when a figure of this seniority gets targeted, that specific diplomatic framework goes through a massive, massive stress test. It really makes you wonder, right? Can a ceasefire hold, even in name only, when the underlying command structures are actively being dismantled?
Which brings us to part 3, Lebanon-Israel-Washington talks. Let's zoom out a bit and see how these ground-level tensions are messing with high-level diplomacy halfway across the world.
Over in D.C., trilateral talks are happening, but honestly, they are producing wildly contradictory realities. On one hand, Lebanon is out there projecting that these talks had delivered tangible progress, which signals a clear desire for a diplomatic off-ramp. But then, you look at the reports out of Tel Aviv, and it's the exact opposite. Israel is maintaining a hard line, saying negotiations show very little progress and remain deeply strained. This stark disconnect pretty much screams that one, or maybe both sides, are just posturing heavily for their audiences back home. It's classic diplomatic stalling, right? Projecting this aura of cooperation while actually holding firm lines. It makes the mediator's job of bridging that gap almost impossible.
And caught right in the middle of all this is the U.S. mediator, who is somehow projecting a very positive atmosphere despite the blatant contradictions. But here is the real takeaway you need to pay attention to. Reports show that first contact has actually been established between the Washington negotiating delegation and Lebanon's president. Now, in the world of high-stakes diplomacy, getting that direct first-level contact, that's a huge deal. It matters because despite all that public posturing and gridlock we just talked about, the U.S. is aggressively keeping those back channels wide open. They're basically trying to weave a safety net together while the tightrope they're standing on is literally fraying underneath them.
All right, let's jump into part 4, a multi-front regional escalation. Let's step out of the quiet diplomatic rooms in Washington and look at the highly kinetic reality playing out across the region.
Because while the diplomats are passing memos, the reality on the ground is moving at absolute breakneck speed. Just look at this timeline in Lebanon. First, the Israeli military issues urgent evacuation warnings for residents down in Tyre. Then, bam, it instantly escalates into evening airstrikes hitting Beirut's southern suburbs. And finally, this rapid-fire succession culminates in a devastating strike in Sur El Gharbia that destroyed an entire 3-story building, leaving at least 19 people dead.
The kinetic pace of these military operations is completely blowing past the diplomatic ones. They're essentially creating brand new facts on the ground every few hours.
Now pull back to the broader map, and this is where the sheer scale of the crisis really hits you. We're not just talking about border skirmishes anymore. We are watching massive regional players enter direct sustained conflict. Reports are stating that the Israeli military claims to have wiped out half of Iran's missile stockpiles. Half! That is a staggering degradation of a major power's military capability, and it represents a massive shift in regional deterrence. And, in retaliation, Iran's Revolutionary Guard isn't just focusing on Israel. They are actively targeting U.S. bases and military sites in the Gulf. This is a terrifying escalation because it actively threatens to drag the United States into a direct hot war right there in the region. And the cycle just keeps going, with Israel announcing a brand new wave of strikes directly on Tehran. So, what started as a targeted strike on a single commander in Gaza has exploded into a multi-front theater. We're talking direct military engagements between Israel, Iran, and the United States. The implications for global security here are absolutely massive.
Finally, let's look at Part 5, a fragile path forward. Let's tie all these threads together and examine the deeply complicated road ahead for the Middle East.
Because here is the ultimate contradiction defining the entire region right now. On the diplomatic track, the U.S. is aggressively scrambling to buy time, officially extending the Lebanon-Israel ceasefire by 45 days. But, entirely at odds with that, over on the military track, Israel has stated they intend to take control of a security zone stretching all the way up to Lebanon's Litani River. Now, for those of you familiar with the geography there, the Litani River is roughly 30 kilometers deep inside sovereign Lebanese territory. To put that into perspective, you simply cannot reconcile a 45-day paper ceasefire extension with a simultaneous declaration of physical, territorial military control that goes that deep. It just doesn't compute. These two tracks are on a complete and total collision course.
So what does this all mean? That brings us to the central question of today's explainer. With the deaths of senior officials testing old deals, radically conflicting reports coming out of the negotiation rooms, airstrikes tearing across Lebanon, and missiles flying between Israel, Iran, and U.S. bases, can these drawn-out diplomatic tracks actually outpace the rapidly shifting military realities on the ground? History usually tells us that when diplomacy and military facts collide, the facts on the ground tend to win. The next few weeks are going to decide if this time things play out differently. Thanks so much for exploring this incredibly complex web with us today.